This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. This week's episode has been dedicated in memory of Harav Yitzchak Chaim Moshe ben Benjamin Yaakov. Rabbi Schwartz devoted his life to Torah, Kiruv, and Jewish education, and his loving family dedicated this podcast Le'ilui Nishmato. Welcome back to our Breishit series, These Are Our Heroes, where we're exploring with our guests a central figure from each Parsha, asking them what's meaningful, inspiring, powerful, challenging, and thought-provoking about their behaviors. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office directly. Parshat Vayetze opens with Yaakov running from Esav and from the home of his youth. After arriving in Haran, he goes to sleep and has the famous ladder dream, which awakens him to the presence of God in the area he later names Beit El. God promises him progeny and a bright future. Yaakov builds an altar and vows to return. After this, Yaakov comes upon a well covered by a large stone that must be removed to retrieve its water. Miraculously, Rachel shows up at the same well, and Yaakov, in a moment of inspiration, is able to move the stone and provide her sheep with water. They meet, fall in love, and marry. Well, not quite. As we know, the story that ensues is somewhat more complex because of social norms, because of a less than transparent father-in-law, and because Yaakov's family life seems to constantly be intertwined with struggle. The Parsha continues with the birth of the tribes, a monumental historical development that takes place against the backdrop of strained family dynamics between Leah and Rachel and between Yaakov and his wives. The rest of the Parsha follows the development of Yaakov's family in the house of Lavan. The dealings with the shared flocks again puts Yaakov in this position of being the trickster, likely unintentionally. The same atmosphere shrouds over Rachel's stealing of her father's idols. The family of Yaakov causes distress in the house of Lavan to the point that they must leave. Movingly, the Parsha ends with reconciliation. Lavan catches up with Yaakov, guided by a divine message to speak kindly and put things on the table with Yaakov. It is a moment of familial communication, of a desire to end things well, still sorely missing in Yaakov and Esav's relationship. Beautifully, Yaakov's meeting with Rachel begins with the removal of a stone from a well, and the Parsha ends here with the erection of a monument symbolizing Yaakov and Lavan's alliance. While Yaakov has many more miles to travel, this moment may be the beginning of a more direct form of dialogue that will surface in small ways in the coming chapters. My partner in conversation today is Rabbi Alex Israel, who is a teacher and scholar of Tanakh at Matan, Yeshivat Eretz Tzvi, and Midrash at Lindenbaum. His two books on Melachim Aleph and Bet have been received with great acclaim, and his writings may be found at www.alexisrael.org. Rabbi Alex also has his own Tanakh podcast, which I often recommend to students, which follows the daily 929 learning schedule called the Tanakh Podcast, which can be found on all major podcasting platforms. Rabbi Alex, it's a pleasure to have you back here.
Pleasure to be with you. Always great to be with you, Yosefa. Thank you.
I think it's like our fourth episode together. I didn't gather all the numbers, but at this point, it's been a long time. And I always love having you on Savor Breishit to sort of hear your insights into the dynamics that are, as we said, are complex.
Yes, they are. So I would like to try and focus on, as you said, Yaakov has a life of struggle. He grows up literally from the moment of birth and even before birth. There, he's in a struggle even, in utero. And this continues throughout his life. And I want to talk about the notion of Yaakov's two wives. We have this idea that Avraham and Sarah are a pair. I guess there's the turbulence with Hagar as well, and Yitzchak and Rivka. But suddenly we see that we're going to see two wives which both become matriarchs, both become imahot. And there is a considerable amount of tension between them. We have Rachel, who was meant to be first, with that great love, that 7 years are kiyamim achadim. And then Yaakov ends up being tricked and marrying Leah. And we have Vayehav gam et Rachel mi Leah. Rachel ends up being the second one. And the Jewish from that, and then we see the way that Leah names all her children in a mad rush to achieve Yaakov's love, right? We have the sense of Ra'ah Hashem b'oni Reuven. God's seen how much I suffer. Shimon, Sunu'a Anochi, I'm hated. Levi hapani ishielai. Maybe my husband will pay some attention to me. Until Yehuda, there's a sense of relief. There's a great amount of tension. And this makes me wonder why the hand of fate or the hand of Hashgacha had it that things need to be so turbulent in the house of Yaakov. Right? I understand Yaakov and his brother maybe, but even in his marriages, Rachel and Leah, the sisters, they should be so, maybe you'd imagine, so close. Mm-hmm. Sometimes siblings relationships are close, and here there's this phenomenal tension between them. And this is a tension which maybe is now going to be inherited to their children, to us, the Jewish people.
And it was inherited from previous generations, meaning Rachel and Leah are the female paradigm of the sibling rivalry that we have in all the generations of the Avot and Imahot, right? Starting from, they're not the patriarchs, but we have Cain and Hevel. We have some sort of hierarchy that's created between Noach's sons. And we have, obviously, Abraham and Lot, not related in the same sense, not siblings, but also familial dynamics that are strained. And all the ensuing generations have this, and they're just the female paradigm for this. And your question, I think, is a general question on the book of Breishit. It's even more powerful and maybe painful because they create the DNA genetic foundation for Am Yisrael, which feels like the stakes are even higher than perhaps in previous generations. But it's a difficult question that sort of echoes in our mind throughout much of the book of Breishit.
Yeah, and this makes me wonder whether at some level we have a sort of let's call it a Western expectation that things will be neatly ordered and the relationships will be smooth. Nowadays in our family life, all we want is, that our children will all get on and, they'll be best friends with us as parents. Well, it doesn't always happen quite that way. And might we want to say that, in fact, Chazal sometimes say that people don't really discover something until they trip on it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you've got to fall down on something in order to really deal with it. And could we be saying that the lives of the Avot and now the Imahot are deliberately turbulent, deliberately conflict-filled because they've got things that they need to work through, because the only way that we grow is by somehow, pushing against something? I don't know whether that echoes with you in any way.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that we also could say it slightly differently, which is that they only become the Avot and Imahot because they emerge from these struggles in a way that's so salient and moving, and their personhood really just grows exponentially from this. Meaning, I don't think that it doesn't feel good to say that. I just want to say on a parent level that it's not new to my generation. I think it existed also in the generation that raised me, but I agree with you that it's a Western, and I would even say it's germane to particular cultures that have this emphasis on happy, good, loving, life should just go well. It's a cultural emphasis that doesn't exist in the same way in all different cultures even today, and it's one that I don't identify with at all. Meaning, my job is not to, I want to create, let's say, a normative childhood for my children. So I've done a good job of shielding them from a lot of the terrible things that have happened throughout this year. But it is not my job to provide them with clear, simple, happy. I think that there's very clear lines between those. So, but I think what I identify with what you're saying, that we look at it through the eyes of, look at all these trouble dynamics. I do this all the time. And I feel like in the way you're framing it now, I'm thinking to myself, maybe I'm asking the wrong question. Meaning, this is a given in relationships, particularly in familial relationships, particularly when the stakes are so high. It's either you're the chosen patriarch or matriarch, or you're not, and you get sent away. And so the question becomes, maybe they will only become, they have to rise to the occasion, and then that makes them the personality that is the right personality to be the one that we're supposed to emulate.
Yeah. I want to just say in regards to what you said, but I'm going to say it quickly because I don't want to dwell on this too much.
Okay.
Somebody once told me an amazing thing, that their Masadeh Kiddushin, before they went to a rabbi and said, will you be the rabbi of our wedding? And he said, yes, but I've got one condition. He said, a young engaged couple, madly in love, and he said, I want you to go to a marriage therapist, to a counselor, for 2 or 3 sessions before the wedding. And they said, what do you mean? Like, we've never had a significant argument. So he says, well, I've got news for you. You will. Yeah. And I want you to already have an address that when the problems come up, You have a way of working them through.
Yeah.
And I thought this was the most, first of all, courageous, but wise. In other words, conflict is built into the system. I think it's Simon Sinek, I think I'm pronouncing. He says, you're definitely going to marry the wrong person for you because opposites attract. And then at a certain point, the oppositional side of the person you fall in love with is going to become annoying.
You.
So part of this, if I raise the question like, oh my gosh, can't the avot get on? Can't the imahot get on? This is so terrible. Maybe we, as you said, we need to look at it. We need to expect that there to be conflict. And then the question is how we deal with that conflict. Find mechanisms.
And I think it's unfortunately true that when people go through difficult times, if they're able to rise to the occasion, which I'll just refer to a podcast 2 weeks ago, where we spoke about the Ish Kodesh, which says that sometimes there are nisayonot that people cannot get past. But if somebody is able to rise to the occasion, I mean, we know that feeling of getting to that better space after being in a bad space, of getting to a space of resolution after a time of friction. Like we know what that feels like, and we know that it gives us wisdom. It enables us to enter into other dynamics with wiser sensibilities. You know, we know what that looks like. And I feel like, again, what's really coming out to me here is that I love talking about difficult family dynamics in the book of Breishit, but I feel that the premise of that is not necessarily the right one.
Right.
It should be. It's a book about family, so it's going to be messy. I don't know any family that isn't, and therefore the question is, how does everybody respond to that? What makes the way they respond something great? That is sometimes where I think we're greatly challenged by the book of Breishit, because we don't always look at the responses of our greatest figures and say, not sure I would have responded that way, right? Again, it's easy to judge from afar, and maybe we shouldn't be judging at all. We'll touch upon that as well later on in the conversation. But I feel like that sometimes is also a great challenge, is looking at the way they behave and wondering.
Often when I teach characters in Breishit, I always talk about the fact they have a flaw that they almost have to work through.
Yeah.
And once we work it through, hopefully we have been able to deal with that.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to do is I like to try and present a couple of lenses in order that are used in order to present Rachel and Leah. And before I even begin with that, let's just note that Rachel and Leah are our imahot, and of course they produce the 12 tribes. But even in the 12 tribes, this tension between Rachel and Leah continues. And many have noted that of course the Bechor of Rachel is Yosef. He's the primary character there. Leah has Reuven, Shimon, Levi, but they all sin, and Yehuda seems to become the leading representative. And we see, of course, Yosef and Yehuda in tension in the Yosef story. And this continues, of course, later on in Jewish history. The kingdom splits, and we have two states, two countries, one in the south, Yehuda, and one in the north, which is called Israel, or sometimes Ephraim. It definitely represents the Rachel side of the family, or the leadership of Rachel. So if you want, the Rachel and Leah energies are taken through history. We see with the Meraglim, Kalev and Yehoshua, one Yehuda character and an Ephraim character. And in fact, there are prophecies, prophecy of Yecheskel, which talks about the reunification of Yosef and Yehuda, which in some way is the reunification of Leah and Rachel. So what I want to argue is this is really a fault line in the body politic of the Jewish people. It's like somebody has a deep scar and it's sort of tends to reopen or something like that. Mm-hmm. This is something which is really sitting there at the foundation.
Yeah.
And the question, of course, is why do we need this and what is it, right? Is it just some congenital flaw or what is it? And I want to share with you two lenses. One is going to be by Rav Steinsaltz, Rav Adin Steinsaltz, and the other one by Rav Kook. And I'll try and do this relatively quickly. I always ask my audiences when I talk about this, I'll throw out to an audience and say, well, if you had to choose, who do you like more, Rachel or Leah? Who's more attractive to you, right? Who do you feel a greater pull to? Frequently people will say Rachel. Because, as you said in your introduction, it's love at first sight with Rachel. And we've all learned that midrash about Einei Leah Rakot, that Leah was busy crying. So we have an image of a crying Leah and a gorgeous looking Rachel, right, out there, a shepherdess. What a romantic image. And then I say to them, 1 second, is there any of the imahot who who we sort of see even today maybe as crying. And they say, Rachel mevaka al baneha? How did the crying pass from Leah to Rachel? Leah started crying.
Something else she shared with her sister.
And she ends up crying for the rest of history, as some people will say, on all of our behalf. Well, what's going on there? And Rav Steinsaltz says she sees Leah and brings the Kabbalah and the Midrash, which says that in a way, Leah is more substantial than Rachel. And Rachel is almost like a transitory character. I'll quote a Midrash. V'shem ha-gedola Leah. Leah is the Gedola. Gedola b'matnoteha. She has greater contributions. Kuhuna le'olam. It's out of Levi that we have the kuhuna, the priesthood. Malchut le'olam, the kingship from Yehuda. As it says, V'Yehuda le'olam teshev, etc. However, Rachel ketana b'matnoteha. Yosef l'sha'a. It's not smaller contributions, but more transient, ephemeral, transitional. Yosef was the kingdom which existed for a shorter amount of time. Sha'ul l'sha'a, Shiloh l'sha'a. And he points out, Rav Steinsaltz, that Rachel is full of yearning. We have a huge amount of expectation with Rachel, so much love, but that love is not, so to speak, realized because Leah ends up being the first wife. Rachel so much wants children. One of the conversations, the only conversations we really hear between Rachel and Yaakov is a row. Give me children. She so badly wants children. When she gets a child, she says, calls him Yosef, give me another one. When she gets the other one, is the moment of her death.
Yeah.
Rachel has so much energy, passion, romance, and yet it's a romance that doesn't find its full fulfillment. It has tremendous
have the same
power.
staying power. It doesn't have the same staying power as Leah's.
Right, and Leah has these children one after the other, and she says, I see my pain, I see that I'm hated, maybe my husband will spend time with us. And she gets to the fourth, and she says, Hapam oder Hashem. I don't know what happened at that point. I always wonder, I guess there's one of two options. Either the relationship cheered up, after having 3 kids, and Yaakov has to, accompany her to all the doctor's appointments and the teacher's evenings and, take the kids down to the Gan Shashuim, to the park. Suddenly, Yaakov, who had felt betrayed by Leah, didn't want to sort of have much to do with her at the beginning. Now he has to, he actually discovers, oh my gosh, Leah, she's got an amazing sense of humor. She's like incredibly intelligent. She's a fascinating person to talk to. I love having conversations with her. And suddenly by the 4th child, Hapam oder Hashem. Or by, that's the optimistic.
Or she just made peace with her life, and then she says,
the other option is,
I have to turn to God because my husband clearly isn't a very receptive audience.
I have a terrible marriage, but I've got 4 gorgeous kids, and I'm going to be happy with what I've got.
Yeah.
So the way that Rav Steinsaltz reads Rachel and Leah is that Rachel has this amazing startup energy, right? If you can talk about it in business terms, you might say, there's the startup with the great ideas, but that person doesn't necessarily, after the great idea, suddenly the company plunges. And you need to bring in a sort of, grey-haired, grey-suited executive to take things into profitability.
Another important expression of this is that Rachel is not buried with Yaakov, meaning Leah is buried with Yaakov. She retains that status of wife for eternity next to Yaakov. Rachel takes on a different status that has to do with her motherhood or lack of motherhood. But it's also
Rachel is buried on the way.
She's on the way. She's transitional.
She's transitional.
Yeah.
So therefore, Rachel, as I always say, is like the sprinter. She'll run fast, but she'll run out of breath.
Yeah.
Leah is the marathon runner. She's slow. She's the aim. She's the akeret habayit em habanim smecha.
Yeah.
And this is fascinating. So that therefore we have almost 2 Mashiachs.
I think what's also interesting is that, and you sort of alluded to it in conversations we had prior to this, but it also, of course, is there are 2 different energies that a fuller marriage should have, both of them. Meaning we want that passionate peace. The passionate peace can never take us for the long haul, right? Any couple that stays loving and works together over the years knows that they're going to try and feed the chemistry that got them there, but that in order to have that persist in a way that's healthy and long-term, it's going to have to be molded with this sort of long-term commitment. We're not asking each other every day, are you sure you're really passionately in love with me? Meaning these become questions that they aren't even the right questions 2 decades later, because we're so deep in the commitment. We're in it for the long haul, that if this was subject to the whims of my emotions every single day, that wouldn't be a very healthy marriage. So a fuller marriage is going to have both these pieces. And what seems to be, we don't really know, because I want to be very careful to read it into their marriages, because we know what they feel they're missing, but we don't know what the actual marriage looks like.
Correct.
And so that, like, ultimately we need both of these pieces in a picture that we feel is fuller. There it gets divided into 2 women. So today we have one woman and 1 man. So we want to try and get it right in that one.
Correct. And so these actually play out in Jewish history. Would say Rosh Steinsaltz, let's say we mentioned Shaul L'Sha'ah. Shaul sets up the monarchy. He's tremendous. Yeah. He's the founder. He is the entrepreneur. But then it takes Beit David to sort of bring it to a stability and to give over the dynasty to his child. There's this concept of Mashiach ben Yosef, who is there for the Chevlei Mashiach, who is there for the birth pangs, for the ups and downs, for the contractions of the Mashiach, and then there is the Mashiach ben David, who's meant to take us to the straight, to the stable time.
Yeah.
Now, if you have 2 people who are like this, one who's full of that startup energy, and one who's full of that stability, one who's full of that passion, you can imagine they could really rub each other up the wrong way. They could have a serious amount of tension. But one might also say that I somehow want both of these energies in the Jewish people. I desperately need that. Yeah. And we can understand friction between the energy which animates Rachel, which animates the Yosef characters, and between the Yehuda characters. They're in very different directions. And yet they both bring enormous wealth to the Jewish people.
Yeah, and I think it also makes sense that they don't exist in the same person. And it just takes looking around us at the world to, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the people who are more like that Rachel character, and people I know who are more like the Leah character. And the people who are more like the Rachel character have to work very hard if they want to have staying power in the things they do, to be able to cultivate that kind of continuity. And the people who are really marked by their continuity, by their consistency in a world today that's very flashy, often feel boring, meaning they could feel that lack in their professional life, they could feel that lack, in different realms. And so we often feel when we're functioning in the world today that we have to make space for those energies that we don't have. And then we also at some point have to realize what our limit is and know that there's only so much that we can make up for what we don't have versus reinventing ourselves, which isn't always possible.
Right. It's so important. These 2 different sensibilities of living. Right.
Yeah.
It's
also interesting because we might think, if I could just use like an Eastern term of yin and yang, which we also see very often, it's interesting to me that in the Torah, it's presented through the prism of Rav Steinsaltz through 2 women, meaning these 2 women have energies that are complementary. I don't know if we have that same sense. What about Yaakov is complementary? I'm asking you, do we have what do you think about that? What's complementary about, because I can understand, right? Yitzchak and Rivka is kind of more famously spoken about, that she's the go out, she's the, the Misrat HaChutz, she's able to, and Yitzchak is that more internal, mufnam, he's maybe in the sadeh, but he's really more an internal figure in terms of how we tend to characterize him. I don't know, how would you look at those stories we have of Yaakov and think about how he complements his wives?
Oh, you're talking about within the marriage?
Yeah, within the marriage.
You've stumped me.
That's good. I'm happy to ask questions that make it. We can also just leave it as an open question. But I'm saying we're presenting them with these complementary. It's almost as if Rachel and Leah right now, they're in like a marital relationship with each other, and they're each bringing these different energies. And my question is, and why do I also say that? Because that really mirrors the story of the birth of the tribes. Yaakov is not important. He is, just the male in that scenario. He doesn't feature in the emotional landscape that they paint. He is the backdrop figure. Unfortunately, he's very present in the mind of Leah, but he doesn't feature, right? All the events there, the story of the Dudaim, it's really a story of the women. And I've often said in past years, just in teaching, that, well, it's because the world of having babies really does belong to the women. I love my husband very deeply, but when I'm giving birth, I don't need him. Do you know what I'm saying? You are not the person that I need right now. But But it's interesting because you really do feel like Leah and Rachel in this two-wife situation, their dynamic as like being in a marriage is almost more pronounced than Yaakov.
And then if you're going to say that, then Yaakov has this corollary of Esav.
Yes.
It's Yaakov and Esav and Rachel and Leah. But the actual connection between Yaakov and his particular wives, I'm not quite sure what to do with.
And I don't want to read into the silence. I'm just saying I don't think we have that much information.
Right, we have the Kol Yaakov and the Yadayim Shel Esav, which
Yeah.
each represent different aspects. The Admoni versus the Yoshev Ohalim, and we play off those opposites. But I'm not quite sure how
there's something
Yaakov
about
works
that sibling
with
relationship is so dominant for each of them that we almost lose
They
the
are
sense.
also Gedola and Ketana.
Yes. Interesting. Okay. Just something to think about.
Great. So I just want to give a completely. It's amazing how you can take these paradigms and analyze them from a completely different angle. So I'm going to quickly talk about Rav Kook's lens. Rav Kook, in a very famous speech, which is known as Hamisped B'Yerushalayim, actually did not take place in Yerushalayim. It took place in Yafo, and it was a hesped, which was roundly criticized by the Yishuv Hayashan for Herzl. In 1904, Rav Kook got up to give a hesped for Herzl, who had died quite unexpectedly, and he expressed his Zionist feeling, and he used the model of Yosef and Yehuda. And if we stay with these paradigms, he said Yosef is, there's a midrash which says that Yosef spoke 70 languages. Yosef is the economist. He is the mashbir. He manages the economy. And therefore Yosef is always going to he dreams about, about sheaves. He dreams about the sun and moon and the stars, the cosmic, the economical, and he's the provider. Yosef represented the universal side of things. He's the diplomat. He's the person who represents what every nation needs: infrastructure, economy, diplomacy. Yehuda, Haita Yehuda lekodsho. Yehuda is the Holy One. The Midrash which says Yehuda set up in the yeshivot, in even Yehuda's name has Yud-Hei Vav-Hei in it. I have a son called Yehuda. Sometimes he used to come back from Gan, right, and put his name on his picture, but miss out the Daled, right? And it write Yud-Hei Vav-Hei on his little scrolls when he was 3 years old, And, everybody thinks their child is special, but that Yehuda represents Haita Yehuda lekodsho. So we have, if you want, the more universal and the more holy, the kadosh side. Rav Kook wanted to say that even in terms of the kingdoms, the northern kingdom was always outward looking. It was more susceptible to Avodah Zarah because it was interested in more universal concerns, being more like the Phoenicians or being more like the Assyrians. Whereas Yehuda was more inward looking, and it was able to be more.
Mikdash.
It had the Mikdash. It was more focused on its spiritual, its own inner identity. And of course, what Rav Kook then turns around and says as well, Herzl, right? He says there's a body and a soul, right? The body is universal. The soul is spiritual. A soul needs a body, and a body needs a soul. The Jewish people is made up of Yosef and Yehuda, and of course, Yosef and Yehuda means that we need both the spiritual and the universal. And he's talking to the Haredi world and talking to the Zionist movement. It says the Zionist movement, which is asking the Jewish people to come back to the universals, to come back to having a country, having a government, having an army, having an agriculture, building railroads, right? Also, that needs to lead to a spiritual, to the Haita Yehuda lekodsho, but the spiritual world has to appreciate that you need the physical. Mm-hmm. And so he's also built these really interesting paradigms around Yosef and Yehuda, two things which are essential, and two things which emerge from these two imahot.
Right. What's interesting just about Rav Kook's piece there is that it actually angers both sides, because I think it ruffled feathers on the more Yishuv Yashan, what today we would call Haredi side, that didn't really want to look at this non-religious, secularly oriented power and say that this is an essential power. Meaning that was a particularly Rav Kookian piece to say that we all have a place in this massive project that we're trying to move forward. On the other hand, it in some ways could be looked at as somewhat patronizing for the Mashiach ben Yosef paradigm. As we just said, there's something fleeting about it, meaning you maybe come first, but we're eventually really want to get to this, more kadosh, inwardly focused. I'm not sure Rav Kook would sign on that. I think he would say you really still need both always.
I think so, but you're 100% right. They always quote Brenner as who would hear Rav Kook talk, and he'd say, "Why does he keep on telling me that I'm spiritual?
Exactly.
I'm not. I've rejected all of that stuff."
Yeah, exactly. So it definitely could ruffle on both sides. I think I'll just say what's interesting when you hear sort of these portraits being created is that obviously each of them are taking particular sources and particular angles from the material we have in Tanakh, and other parts are going to be left on the side, meaning neither of these is necessarily representing every single source we have. There are certain trends, right? There are certain trends that are true, but when you're going to look closer at all the sources, you can sort of twist them in different directions, and sometimes it's less clear how you can get to sort of this overarching theme throughout all the sources.
Yeah, so sort of, I guess what I've done in what I presented was to create paradigms, to create archetypes. Well, I didn't. I borrowed them from Rav Steinsaltz and Rav Kook. But what the method that's been done here, and this is a method that we find in lots of different sources, midrashic sources, right? We can talk about Avram is Chesed, and Yitzchak is Gvura, and Yaakov is Tiferet. We could talk about Shachrit Mincha Ma'ariv, right? Those representing. In other words, we like to sort of create categorizations. We like to put things in paradigms and archetypes, and then we can make a system in the madness, right? People's biographies are complicated and messy and unique. And if we can create a pattern, and what happens in these patterns, we can almost take it beyond just Rachel and Leah and take it to the history of the Jewish people and into redemption time, and somehow give ourselves a roadmap of Jewish history. The question is, right, is this a correct reading of the Imahot? Is this a correct reading of Jewish history, of these things? What do you think?
I think it depends on what the goal is of what we're learning. Meaning, if the goal is to, sometimes I worry about this. I say, I know that I'm reading many different things through modern lenses, and how I might teach it 1 year is different than how it comes out 3 years later. And obviously it's being impacted by the life experience that I'm bringing to it, the current events of what's going on around me. And I think that if our goal is meaning making, then I don't think that it necessarily bothers me. I think that one of the difficulties that comes up is this question of what is the frame that is most respectful, meaning I don't have any problem speaking about our avot and imahot through the prism of the human relationships that I recognize today. I just a moment ago did a little bit of marital analysis between Yaakov and his wives. That, to me, when it has a teaching lens and it's something that I can learn from, and these figures are constantly held up as my paradigms or the frames that I use, to me that's an act of Torah. To me that's an act of emulating the Avot and Imahot. Doesn't matter which part of their life or it's coming from the positive or the negative side. But I think that if we're talking about Pshat study, so obviously some of them don't necessarily echo the Pshat in the most clear way. But I'm curious also what you think about it. We just did it in the podcast, so, but I'm curious what you think about it in your heart.
Oh, I sort of want to hold on to both a little bit, because on the one hand, if I take, psychological studies and I, take an analysis and try and sort of analyze what Avram must have been feeling going on to the Akedah, and on the one hand, these are really Anakei Haruach, these are heroes of the spirit, these are our founders. And we can try and apply the latest psychological theories that are in vogue and apply them. But first of all, is that in any way accurate? How much am I reading in and how much am I reading out? And I also wonder whether it is my role to somehow put them on the psychologist's couch and to do that. And one of the things that we achieve when we put them into a paradigm, and especially if it's an elevated one, Avraham is the knight of faith, right? Or Avraham personifies Chesed, is we manage to elevate him in something which is very pristine, very safe, very...
It's also an archetype, though.
Yes. So I'm saying
Yeah, it's a pristine archetype.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I say those archetypes, and by the way, you can say what chesed lacks as opposed to, emet or whatever it is. But on the one hand, it's in other words, the Avot were people, but the Avot are the pillars, right? Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. And I think as a modern Orthodox person, I struggle with that tension. I love to read the words and discover a new nuance, and suddenly something lights up for me with something I maybe read last week or last year, and I think about a new angle that it might be possible in the world of reading the Tanakh. And it was the Rashbam who spoke about the Pshat HaMitchadesh B'chol Yom, that there are new understandings that can be revealed every day, and I assume they're revealed every day because every day is a new experience. And to a certain degree, that is what really is exciting about learning Torah, and it's that chidush. But on the other hand, people, and I certainly find this happens with people to the right, sometimes find that exceedingly threatening, and they say, one second, you are bringing the Avot down to our eye level. I don't intend them to be on my eye level. They, for me, are the Avot. And yet at the same time, people are very hesitant to put them in that level because they feel, who are you to judge them?
Yeah, I think often what I also speak about what I speak to students about is this idea that, throughout the generations, straight up Tanakh reading was not particularly fashionable. This is a newer phenomenon in the past century where we're opening up Tanakh. Of course, we're using commentaries, and that's very significant in our learning, but putting emphasis also on what's actually written, because throughout the generations, we got very used to, through midrashic lenses, through reading Tanakh through the prism of these archetypes and of these, expansions on the narrative that Chazal provided for us. And today, people like you and I, when we're learning Tanakh, will present that as one of the lenses that we can learn the story with, but it's not necessarily the exclusive lens of the story.
But I will maybe try and close a little bit by saying that a lot of people don't pay too much attention to the end of Parshat Vayetze.
Yeah.
But at the end of Parshat Vayetze, Yaakov talks to his wives and says, you know, it's time to leave. We've got to get out of here. Mm-hmm. And then you find actually Rachel and Leah talking in unison. They said, we always felt that we were outsiders to our father. And it's very interesting as we've spoken about their differences at the beginning of their relationship, right? And as we've spoken about different paradigms, if we come back to the Pshat, if we come back to reading the story, mm-hmm. At the end of the story, as they're leaving, you must sense a closeness, an identification between Rachel and Leah talking in a single voice, which is a great example of how the Pshat offers us sometimes more nuance than these paradigms which sometimes impose themselves on the text. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you know, suddenly we start seeing the unique, you know, you can't always put things in neat boxes.
Yeah. I think that we obviously need a bit of both of those. We need a bit of the broader characterization to be able to sort of wrap our head around also just the breadth of the story and the figures that persist throughout generations in different books. But I think that looking at very specific moments are also going to be no less illuminating than those broad characterizations that we've suggested.
Beautiful.
Rav Alex, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure. It's wonderful. I have to say that I always talk about this Rachel and Leah division and thinking about the Jewish people. And we felt over the last 2 years a great sense of divisions in our nation. And I always hope that Rachel and Leah can give us hope to understand that though we have really different characters in different sectors of the Jewish people, we are all part of one people. And we should actually embrace the uniqueness of each different group and realize that our diversity can give our Jewish people strength and can give our Jewish people depth, and that it's natural that the differences rub up against each other, but they can also be a huge source of strength and resilience for the future.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.